Chapter 101, The Interruption, Hanyu's POV. When he was 10 or 11, Hanyu had a favorite story. He'd found the book in a dusty corner of the temple library, knocked to the back of a shelf and hidden behind bigger volumes. It told the story of a girl who saved an injured wild camel and then befriended him until she could ride him all over the desert. Hanyu had especially liked the parts where she galloped over the dunes, wild and free with the wind in her hair. But now he wished he'd paid more attention to the beginning. How did the girl soothe the skittish creature so he didn't run away from her? Antony was avoiding his gaze, and he flinched away if Hanyu seemed likely to brush against him. It was almost certainly sacrilege to envision a lord of the gods as a frightened, injured camel, but Hanyu couldn't think of anything else as he sat beside his master for feeding and felt Antony's hand shaking. What's he worried about now? If Hanyu was unsure of his master's thoughts and feelings, it would be harder to please him. The thought should have been terrifying. Instead, Hanyu surprised himself by feeling fond. Lord Julia was right. What a fuss budget. Antony worried that Hanyu wanted to go live somewhere else. He worried that Hanyu was angry with him. Now he had some new mysterious fear in mind, and he clearly couldn't even let it go long enough to eat a meal in peace. Hanyu would have to coax it out of him once they were alone, then do his best to reassure him. It was becoming a pattern, and Hanyu found it a comfortable one. He wouldn't mind drawing out and then talking through Antony's worries for the rest of his life. He stopped thinking when Antony's lips pressed onto his neck. Gods, he would never get used to this closeness, this intimacy, this feeling of being locked together. The abject surrender of it, baring his throat, taking as vulnerable a position as it was possible to be in, wasn't nearly as frightening as it had been at first. After all, it was Antony, the person he trusted most in the world. Hanyu could give himself over to Antony without so much as a twinge of nerves, even if Antony himself trembled as he accepted the offering. He pulled in a soft gasp at the quick burn of the god's fangs, piercing, penetrating. Damn it! Hanyu had been determined to stop acting this way about feeding since it made Lord Theodora uncomfortable. But the little spark of pain was its own strange, sharp pleasure, coming as it did just before the heady rush of delicious heat that always accompanied a feeding. Antony pressed against him, his chilly lips at Hanyu's throat, his hand clutching Hanyu's shoulder, and everything was perfect. Then the curtains rustled and Marcus's voice boomed out to fill the room. It had been so much fun to disparage the war god with Lord Theodora. Her presence and approval had felt like a shield, and he'd been giddy with the chance to say all the things he wouldn't usually say in front of Antony. There had been a dizzying feeling of childish naughtiness as he announced that he didn't respect Marcus and wouldn't call him Lord or even be polite. As soon as he heard that voice, all his defiance crumbled into dust. "Theo!" Marcus cried. "And Annie and little Hanyu, too." Everything in Hanyu's body seemed to flash cold and still at the sound of his name in Marcus's mouth. Antony pulled back, his fangs slipping away, and even though Hanyu still had his master's hand on one shoulder and Lord Theodora's on the other, he couldn't help feeling abandoned. Silently, his bravado gone, Hanyu wobbled down into a bow between them. He only hoped that if he made himself small enough, he could avoid any further notice. "I hope you don't mind that I'm joining you early," Marcus continued gaily. "I just get so bored sitting in my rooms all by myself, you know?" All by himself because Asao was gone, because Marcus couldn't beat him and hurt him and break his fingers anymore, because he couldn't flay open Antony's back. Hanyu's hatred seemed to coincide into a tight, hot ball in the pit of his belly, but it was a frail emotion when compared with his fear. "Marcus!" Antony said, with a strange, jumpy guilt in his voice, as though he'd been caught doing something he shouldn't. "It's good to see you, darling. Is there anything you plan to get from the island?" Marcus's tone was lightly teasing, just a hair away from condescension, and Hanyu hated him. Oh my, straight to business. Since when are you such a worker bee, Annie? I thought lounging around painting and playing broody music was more your style. Are you going to answer our leader's perfectly polite question or just insult him? Lord Theodora snapped. Her irritation matched Hanyu's own, but even so, he found himself hunkering down deeper into his bow. His hands itched to reach up and cover his head and neck. Every beat of his suddenly racing heart seemed to carry with it a memory. Cowering against the wall in the hallway while Marcus reached careless hands out to pluck hairs from his robe. Leaning over the table while Antony went to fetch the cane and Marcus's eyes crawled over him like ants. Groveling on the floor while Asao pleaded on his behalf and tried to take responsibility for his trespassing. In every single one of those moments, Marcus had maintained the same tone of condescending amusement. Even now, with Antony and Lord Theodora present, Hanyu couldn't resist the sickening sense that Marcus was in control. As if to prove the point, the war god laughed delightedly. Oh, Theo, don't be such a grouch. My Annie knows I'm just teasing. Isn't that right, darling? Of course, Antony said hastily. Then, Hanyu, for goodness sake, let me bandage you. You're bleeding. He was right, Hanyu realized, noticing the trickle of warm liquid dripping down the side of his neck. Blood always flowed slowly and sparingly from feeding wounds, and they healed rapidly. Antony said it was some kind of venom he injected when he bit, though Hanyu thought it was much more interesting to view it as a leakage of divine power. But they still needed to be covered for a bit after each feeding. He lifted his head reluctantly. Yes, my lord, he murmured, though of course he could never speak softly enough to avoid Marcus's godly hearing. Antony bandaged him with the quick efficiency of long practice, but Hanyu wasn't able to enjoy the gentle touches as much as he usually did. He could feel Marcus's eyes on their interaction, assessing. What did the horrible god hope to learn from watching them so avidly? There, Antony said at last. Does it hurt? You're not lightheaded, are you? Hanyu dared to glance up through his lashes and saw that his master's attention was fully focused on him. Antony's lips were drawn into a thin, fussy line, and his pale eyes were concerned, but they weren't darting towards Marcus. Hanyu appeared to be the center of his attention. The realization sparked something bright and happy in his belly, where it battled his anger and dread for space. Antony never focused on him when his lover was present, not wholly. He couldn't help preening a little under his master's gaze, especially since he was quite sure that the war god had noticed the shift as well. Your servant is quite well, my lord, he said demurely, all but batting his eyelashes and hoping that Marcus could see. You honor me with your kind attentions. Marcus drew in a deep breath and hummed appreciatively. He smells delicious. I can certainly see why you decided to keep him around after all, no matter how tempted you were to trade him for one of the others. Oh, gods! Hanyu had known that Antony found him annoying at first. He'd banished him to the sitting room after all, and told him to be quiet several times. But Hanyu had never thought... When had he changed his mind? He had, hadn't he? I didn't... When did I say that? Antony sputtered. I never... Don't you remember the first day when you told us about how he spit all over you? Marcus chuckled. You said he was so annoying he'd be lucky if he lasted the full 6 years without you wringing his neck, and it would probably be for the best to get rid of him. Hanyu's satisfaction in piquing the war god had dwindled to nothing. He bowed his head deeper to hide the tears that suddenly burned his eyes. Antony had really said all that? His Antony? His kindly master, who just yesterday had cried in relief that Hanyu wasn't angry with him? It seemed impossible, but Antony looked so shamefaced. Did Hanyu really know him at all? Antony said some unkind things that day, but he never said he was going to get rid of Hanyu, Lord Theodora said sharply. Anyhow, what's past is past. Now we all know just how lucky he is to have Hanyu as his attendant. Hanyu could have kissed her feet. So serious, Theo, Marcus said lazily. It's all in good fun. Lord Theodora's voice was hard. Well, I'm not having fun, so let's talk about something else. Marcus laughed again. Don't you have any sense of humor? No, Lord Theodora said flatly. I don't. It's a flaw of mine. Still, you're in my rooms, and if you can't be polite to my other guests, I'll have to ask you to leave. Polite? Marcus scoffed. Annie and I are lovers. We're a bit past polite, don't you think? I was talking about Hanyu. Lord Theodora is my favorite person in the whole world after Antony and Esau. Maybe. She's definitely my second or third favorite. Marcus snorted. A guest? I know you two are besotted with this overgrown morsel, but really... Antony tensed, pulled in a deep breath, then stood up and brushed off his trousers. Marcus, stop it, right now. You're making me wish I hadn't invited you to this meeting. I don't technically need to consult with anyone but Theodora. You are here as a courtesy, and you're not being especially courteous. All right, no more talk of rocky beginnings, Marcus conceded. I hardly see why it matters so much. We all know you two are inseparable now. After all, here's Hanyu at a planning meeting. He said it the way Hanyu might have said, here's a baboon leading morning prayers. He's doing me a favor, growled Antony. Marcus hummed. But not Esau, I can't help noticing. You don't find him quite as captivating, Annie? Should he have spit at you? Is that the way to your heart these days? Circles under Esau's eyes, a splint on his finger, bruises scattered over his body in horrifying constellations. Anger started to overtake Hanyu's fear. He felt like he was on one of the swings back at the temple, rocking wildly between the two emotions and unable to stick with one long enough to come up with anything he could say or do. Marcus! Antony's voice had a warning edge to it. You don't want to bring Esau into this or any conversation. Trust me. I said I was sorry. What more do you want? We can't all brood over our sins and alphabetize them every day like you do, darling. Antony let out a soft huff. All right. Theo, you and your men decide how to approach the island. Send one of them with Hanyu if you need me for anything, but I highly doubt you will. Marcus, come on. We're going to go talk in your rooms. Hanyu couldn't help looking up as his master stalked away. Marcus followed on his heels, uncomplaining. Just before the war god passed through Lord Theodora's curtain, he glanced back, saw Hanyu staring at him, and winked jovially. This is exactly what he wanted. Hanyu and Lord Theodora stared at one another for a long moment after the other two had gone, after the flurry of men's voices bidding them a nervous farewell, after the heavy door shutting after them. Finally, Lord Theodora grabbed a pillow from her bed, pressed it to her face, and let out a muffled scream. Sorry, she said when she let the pillow fall again. I hate him! Hanyu couldn't have agreed more.